Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here in Madrid. This has been a very nice trip. The GIC organized a nice conference in Frankfurt with the Bundesbank and here today, so it's very nice. And it's somewhat easy to deliver on a request like this, and I find myself still wanting to thank Jose Manuel for honoring his commitment to come to Chicago in September of 2008 after Lehman Brothers had occurred and when everyone was trying to figure that out. And he came to Chicago to speak and open our international banking conference that was co-sponsored with the ECB. So thank you once again. And Rafael, it's always nice when people are paying attention to your speeches, and so thank you very much. Today, I'd like to make a few comments about the situation in the United States, the economic outlook as I see it, and the adjustment in monetary policy recently. And before I forget, I'd like to say these are my comments only and not those of anyone else in the Federal Reserve System or my colleagues on the Federal Open Market Committee. Well, I would say that in the U.S., the economic outlook is really quite good. See, I'm going to try to figure out how long I'm speaking. Okay, all right. The economic outlook in the U.S. is the fundamentals are still strong. There have been some unevenness in the data most recently. Let me talk about that. But I'd say the bright spot in the U.S. is the consumer. Consumer spending has been quite strong for quite some time. The consumer has benefited from a vibrant labor market in the United States. Unemployment has fallen to 3.7% nationally. It is being shared quite well everywhere throughout the United States and also across different income groups. Folks have benefited, and so I would say it has brought more low-income, low-skill workers into the workforce to improve their attachment to the workforce, and that potentially has longer-term gains as well for our economy. So that has been quite a positive. I'd say the downside for the U.S. has been on the business spending side. Capital expenditures have been negative at various points. We've heard many reports about businesses being nervous about the trade uncertainty, the trade brinksmanship that's been taking place, the U.S.-China trade negotiations, and other aspects of that. The ISM report just the other day came out, and it sort of confirmed that manufacturing, according to that index, is contracting 2 months below 50, and that seems to be a bit in line with business reports that so many of us have received about capital expenditures, spending, sort of being on the sidelines waiting for a resolution of uncertainties about trade. Foreign growth is weakened as well, and so in this environment, it's still quite remarkable that my outlook for the U.S. economy is for 2.25% growth in 2019, and I would say a run rate going forward is about 2% for the next 18 months, with growth decelerating to trend, and I put trend at 1.75%. I would say that on the weaker side has been the inflation outlook, that inflation has been underrunning our 2% symmetric objective for quite some time. We had briefly gotten back up to 2% on a core PCE inflation basis, but then we retreated a bit. So it's been quite a challenge, perennially disappointing to find that what we thought was the inflation data moving up with momentum, 2%, finding headwinds and retreating. So in that context, you might be surprised if you haven't been paying attention as much as we do to the U.S. data, that monetary policy in the U.S. has sort of changed directions from 2018 to where we are currently in 2019. So let me talk about that for a little bit. And back in 2018, I would say that there were two distinct lines of focus for monetary policy. One was that foreign growth was very strong in 2017, and the entire world was enjoying a resurgence of growth. In the U.S., there was the expectation of fiscal stimulus and then actual fiscal stimulus with tax cuts and corporate tax reform in the United States. The architects of this fiscal expansion allowed themselves to increase the national debt by $1.5 trillion over a 10-year basis in order to pass the legislation. And then on top of that, Congress and the President agreed to increase federal spending as well, and so that increased stimulus by a few $100 billion as well. In an environment with business deregulation, which had been expected for some time under the new administration and actually being put into place, and the tax cuts, it looked as if aggregate demand was very strong, that the U.S. economy continued to be growing above trend. Unemployment was falling below most estimates of the sustainable level of unemployment, and inflation looked like it was going to move up to 2%. So in this context, it made sense to most central bankers that the Fed should move to remove the very large amount of accommodation that had been in place for some time, with interest rates rising from zero slowly, and move up at least towards a neutral rate, if not beyond the neutral rate. And so the question is, we should gradually remove accommodation, and how far should we go? Should it move towards a restrictive setting? That was the thinking in 2018. At the same time, another line of focus is that inflation pressures seemed to be moving up to 2%. It looked like they were moving up with momentum. And a question that continued to bother me was whether or not it would be sustainable. It would be sustainable at 2%, and we'd go forward. We have as our inflation objective that it's a 2% symmetric objective, and so we should spend time above 2% as well as below 2% and hopefully average 2%. And so, in my opinion, it made sense that we should strive to overshoot inflation a little bit, and the undershooting of the unemployment rate below a sustainable level could help support that as well. But it turned out that there were some bothersome developments in the inflation data, some relative price changes that found their way into softening inflation data, telecommunications pricing of internet data capability changed things a fair amount, and it was unclear how much that was going to reduce inflationary pressures, and it called into question how restrictive policy should be. And so in that context, my own thinking on monetary policy was we should strive for some monetary policy setting ultimately at the end of the rate cycle of something that's just a little bit restrictive, say 50 basis points above my assessment of a neutral rate, which is not very restrictive. If we had been able to pull that off, that would have been about the least restrictive monetary policy at the peak of an economic cycle that I can remember in the post-war period. So I thought that could be enough. Going into the December 2018 FOMC meeting, I brought that thinking, and I thought that we would increase rates by 1/4 point, as we had done 3 times already that year, and fundamentals continued to be strong. But the economic risks seemed to be increasing. There was more uncertainty associated with trade discussion. The tax bill that was supposed to, the architects of the tax bill had indicated that they expected business investment to be increasing quite substantially. That was one of the benefits, and it was really tough to see that on business fixed investment. Trade negotiations were dampening the appetite to expand capacity, and foreign growth was weakening as well. On top of that, there was financial volatility in the fall of 2018, and critics of the Fed referred to our reduction of the balance sheet over a slow period of time as quantitative tightening, which I didn't exactly subscribe to myself. I thought it was a rebalancing, but at any rate, there were many critics who were kind of questioning whether or not we should be as restrictive as that. So the December FOMC meeting raised the funds rate by 25 basis points and continued the balance sheet decline. And then the data began to soften a little bit more in the economic data. And so the committee took a pause beginning in January, looked at the data. We indicated at every opportunity that we were data dependent, went through the spring, and we did not increase rates at that point. And it did seem to be a concern that inflation was not staying up at 2%. So that was sort of the environment that took us into June of 2019, when all of a sudden the Fed decided to cut interest rates 25 basis points, and then in the July meeting. and then in September, another 25 basis points. And so I've referred, Chair Powell has referred to this as a mid-cycle adjustment, one where all of a sudden, because of the headwinds that we were facing, it seemed appropriate to strive for a monetary policy setting that was slightly accommodative, I would say 50 basis points below a neutral setting, as opposed to what I'd previously thought of as 50 basis points above that. Now, I do think that this entire adjustment could have been justified on the basis of the weaker inflation data. That is, I am concerned about risk management, that there are headwinds that the U.S. economy is facing. The ISM data is one example of that in manufacturing. But it's also the case that because inflation has persistently underrun our 2% inflation objective, that we ought to just absolutely make sure that we get to 2% and beyond. And so I could easily have argued and would have supported cutting the funds rate on the basis of just pointing to inflationary pressures. I think that would have better guaranteed that inflation could have been rising to 2%, as well as provide more risk resilience. I think when we're focusing on a symmetric inflation objective of 2%, this is a term that few central banks use, and I think that we've all sort of struggled to explain this. In our long-run strategy, we basically say it's symmetric. We indicate that the committee would be concerned, could be concerned if inflation persistently stayed below 2% or above 2%, but we don't really describe the path or any type of adjustments for underrunning or for overrunning. And I think that any additional descriptions of symmetry would be welcome. In this context, I think it's important to actually overshoot inflation and go above 2%. So I think our current risk positioning is good for the current setting of the U.S. economy. Like I say, I'm looking for 2% growth, but there are downside risks. I think that adjusting policy by 50 or 75 basis points helps businesses and consumers and employers if things soften a little bit. I would say that if there's a more nonlinear response, if there's an event that shocks the world economy or the U.S. economy, these modest adjustments aren't going to have been nearly enough. This is very much just risk management to help make things work out better as we strive to bring in growth at about 2% over the next 18 months. And so I think that's been helpful. I think that's a good setting for the U.S. policy. I think I'll stop at that point and entertain questions from the moderator and also everyone else.
Okay,
thank you.
Charles,
very much.
thanks.